This is lecture 4 for Psych 1040, and it's going to be covering two big topics, surveys and research ethics. So in this lecture, I'm going to focus in the first half of the lecture on survey design, and we'll be covering several different elements about survey design, including some key definitions around surveys, types of surveys, sampling methods, the error and bias issues, and how to write some good questions for your survey. The other part of today's lecture is going to focus on ethics and specifically about research ethics, and I'll get more to that later in the lecture. So we're back still at the beginning of this flowchart, looking at the issue of how we design a study. And you might remember from a previous lecture that we said that there are sort of four big options we have in psychology for how we might want to design our study. That is, we might choose to conduct our study as an experiment, a quasi-experiment, a survey, and or a case study. Now today, again, obviously we're going to be focusing on surveys, and we run into surveys all the time. I'm sure you've been asked to fill out things like this, questions where you read a statement and then indicate how much you agree or disagree, or how very good or very bad, that kind of thing, right? So that's what we mean when we're talking about a survey. And the thing about surveys is that they have a lot to do with this issue of making inferences about populations based on samples that we measure in our survey. So, for instance, here what I'm trying to depict is a population out there in the world, and then a sample that we actually use in our survey. The population then is an entire collection of people, events, or things that a researcher is interested in. So this would be very large and possibly impossible to ever fully know everybody in the population. So it's this potentially very large collection of things that we're interested in. But we end up doing in psychology is working with samples, a subset that's drawn from the population that we use to make inferences about the population. So we'd like to be able to make sort of generalities and descriptions and statements about what the population is like, but we're going to be working with a sample, which is just a subset that's drawn from that population. So a survey is then a systematic method for gathering information from a sample to make inferences about a population's attitudes, behaviors, opinions, and beliefs. So this is very much used to try to make inferences, probabilistic inferences about what a population's attitudes, behaviors, opinions, and beliefs are. It does not involve the manipulation of an independent variable. So in a survey, we don't manipulate independent variables. We save that for experiments, or at the very least a quasi-experiment. So we could say then that if our survey actually does have something where we used random assignment to put people in one condition versus another, that our survey isn't really a survey, it's actually an experiment. So here, in today's lecture, we're just really focusing on when we gather information about our sample and then try to make inferences about the population from it. Now there's a few different instruments we could use to conduct our survey. One thing we could do is we could use a questionnaire. So questionnaires are quite commonly used in surveys. You could print out your questionnaire, distribute it to everybody in class. You could go to a shopping center and pass out your questionnaire. Questionnaires are used all the time as possible surveys. And you could also have it set up as a web page where you give people a link and then they go to a web page and they answer some questions. It's another place where you could possibly conduct a survey. And finally, another way that we conduct surveys is through interviews. And interviews then are more one-on-one, where the interviewer is going to ask questions of a respondent. And they can do this face-to-face. So they might be sitting across the table from each other or standing with a clipboard and asking somebody as they're walking out to their car. But it could also be done on the phone. There are many phone surveys done, and perhaps you've actually been subjected to this, where you get a phone call and it turns out there's somebody on the other end who's conducting a survey. It could be done on Zoom now, that's another way to do it. So there's many ways you could conduct this interview, but probably the way that you would normally think of an interview is it kind of goes back and forth between the interviewer and the respondent. Whereas in a questionnaire, you just hand the person the questionnaire, you don't talk to them again until they're done with the questionnaire. In an interview, there's a lot of back and forth between the interviewer and the respondent. Now, a further distinction we can make about surveys is in terms of the amount of times that we actually make measurements. So in longitudinal surveys, we have multiple time points. That is that we're going to conduct our survey over, years or maybe just weeks or a couple days. But we're going to go ahead and measure it now. We're going to measure it tomorrow. We'll measure again in a week. And so we're trying to track over time people's responses and use that to make some sort of inference about the population. And there are different kinds of longitudinal surveys. One type is called a cohort. This is where you have a different sample drawn from the population at each time point. So today's survey might be conducted with this 1,000 people, and then when you go ahead and conduct the same survey again in another month, you randomly pick another 1,000 people. So they would be a different sample. This is also known as a successive cross-sectional study, okay, when you do a cohort longitudinal survey. Another kind of longitudinal survey is called a panel survey. And this is when you have the same sample of participants that you study at each time point. So you get maybe 200 people to agree that you will ask them questions at multiple times in the future, maybe once a week for the next 6 weeks. And so they're a panel survey because they're going to be the same people asked these questions every single time. So that's the longitudinal survey where you're measuring, making measurements over multiple time points. And then there's also a cross-sectional survey, and this is done just at one point in time. So like today or next Saturday at 5 o'clock. And perhaps all you're trying to do there is just compare different kinds of samples at once. So for instance, maybe you get a sample of young people and a sample of old people next Monday, and you want to compare how old people and young people differ and how they view some particular issue. So cross-sectional is just done at one point in time. Now, these sampling methods do require that we pick people from the population, right? And we have to pick our observations from the population. So then the question is, how do we draw our samples from the population? Well, this is more of a challenge than you might think. Let's say that we have a list of everyone who lives in New South Wales here in Australia. This would be our sampling frame, a list of all the members of the population of interest. Now, a sampling frame means that I have some way of having an access to the entire population I'm interested in, and I have all of their contact details, right? So keep in mind that this isn't always available. So for instance, if I said my sampling frame is the world population, I don't know how you would do that. You'd have to have everybody listed in the world, and I don't think that that's possible. So a sampling frame is when you have a specific list of whatever the population is of interest. So not all populations are able to be changed into a sampling frame. But anyway, let's say that the government has kept track of everyone in New South Wales, so that's why we have our sampling frame, and they're willing to share with us this list of all the members of New South Wales. Okay? Now, think about that a little bit. If I have this list of all of New South Wales, there are some potential problems with the sampling frame. That is, the sampling frame itself, this list that I have, could have problems. And one of the problems could be that it could have missing elements. So this might mean that despite the best efforts of the government, they don't actually have every single person in New South Wales on the list. That somehow a few people were left off the list by mistake, or maybe at the time of the census they weren't counted, or whatever it is. They just don't have them in the list. So that would be one potential problem with my sampling frame. Another potential problem with sampling frames is what are called foreign elements. And so foreign elements are elements that don't belong on the sampling frame. They just inadvertently were put into the list. So maybe, for example, some tourists were visiting Sydney and they happen to get on the list of all New South Wales residents, and they're not actually from New South Wales at all. Maybe they're from another country. So we consider that a foreign element because that person being on the sample frame is not correct. They shouldn't be in there, all right? So they really should be off the list. There also could be duplicate entries. So it could be that the sampling frame that I get from the government actually includes the same person a couple times, maybe because in one list he's called Richard and another time he was called Rich. And so Richard and Rich are the exact same person here, but somehow I don't know that, and so I get duplicate entries. And I also could have what are called misidentified entries. So in the sampling frame, I'm really depending on the integrity of the sampling frame that I'm getting from the government, whatever, to be clear. But perhaps maybe one of the mistakes is that some businesses got included on the list. And so they're not actually individual people. that are in my sampling frame all the time. Maybe occasionally some business got put in there just by mistake. And so when I try to include them then as my sample, I'm going to be using a business rather than actually a person. So that's what I mean by misidentified entries. So these are all potential problems with the integrity of a sampling frame, that I might have this great gigantic list of everybody who lives in New South Wales, but there could be missing elements, foreign elements, duplicate entries, and misidentified entries. Now let's say though, I have a very good sampling frame for New South Wales. And at the latest census count, it was something like 8.166 million people lived in New South Wales. Now, how am I going to choose my sample from this 8.166 million people? Well, what I can do is I can use what's called probability sampling. So what I'm going to be doing is using random sampling. I want to randomly sample people from this entire sampling frame. So I will pick a sample based on randomness using randomization. And the simplest thing to do is what's called a simple random sample. So that would mean that everybody in my sampling frame has an equal chance of being selected. So as I draw my sample, every single person, all 8.166 million people, could be sampled. I could also choose, though, to do what's called a stratified random sample. And what I would do here is I would again randomly choose people from the population, from the sampling frame, but I might have specific characteristics that I want to have represented in my sample. So for example, if I know that 20% of the population is over the age of 60, then what I might want to make sure is that I get 1/5 of my sample to be over the age of 60. So I have stratifications or groups that I want to make sure I get exactly the same percentage that represents what might be going on in the population. A third type of probability sampling is known as cluster random sampling. And what we do here is it's not so much based on some personal characteristics of people that I'm looking at. Instead, what I might do is just say, I'm going to go ahead and pick certain postcodes or certain clusters or regions of people. Maybe I just pick everybody who's in the southern part of the state, or small groups of 10,000 people here and there. So what I'm doing is, instead of just letting all 8.166 million people get picked just a chance, I'm actually going to pick clusters at a time and then get everybody in that cluster in my sample. So I might pick 10 postcodes at random and make sure that everybody in those 10 postcodes will end up in my sample. So those are all based on probability. They all have some randomization that's involved in them. There's also the chance that we could do sampling from the sample frame that's non-probability. That is, we don't use randomness. And this would include, for instance, convenience samples. So convenience is just like we talked about in a previous lecture. It's convenient to me as a researcher who I sample. So what I do is I just contact whoever I can possibly get, maybe their friends and family, maybe anybody who fills out my survey or sees it in an ad. Whatever that is, that's a convenience sample. So that's not a random sample. And then also I could do what's called purposive sampling, where I'm not really interested in all 8.16 million people. What maybe I'm interested in is everybody who happened to buy a car in the past year. And so I'm only going to go ahead and ask people who bought cars to complete my sample. So you'll see that neither one of those cases, I'm not actually randomly picking people from the population, from the sample frame. I'm going to use something that's either convenient or has some special purpose. So that's what we mean by non-probability sample. Okay, so those are all different kinds of sampling from the sample frame. But one issue that we're not really ready to talk about yet is how many people we should select from the sample frame or from the population to make up our sample. Because you see, the issue of sample size, like whether or not we should have 50 people in our sample or 10,000 people, is really a statistical issue that we will come back to in future lectures. So in future lectures, we do talk a lot more about sample size. Remember, it's one of the pillars that I think of as a foundation of statistics and psychology. And so we come back to this issue more and more as we talk about statistics and things like power. Okay, so we're not going to worry too much right now about the sample size. I want you to focus more on how we actually pick the sample. Now, in picking the sample, we could have some sampling error. And sampling error is a very precise, again, sort of statistic. In fact, it is a statistic that you could quantify. It's a statistic that's equal to the error associated with estimating the true value of some characteristic of the population. So This means that there's some way that I can measure how much error I have when I'm trying to estimate the characteristic in the population. So it's a statistical number, okay? And again, we don't at this point need to know how we compute such a number, just know it is a statistic. And that this error, that the sampling error, is actually affected by any bias we have in our sampling. So when I don't use a truly random, a random sample, I'm more likely to have bias then, because if I'm not randomly picking from the population, then there might be some bias in the way that I am selecting people. So randomization protects against this as much as we can. So that's why we prefer randomization, but we still might have problems that we can end up getting some bias in our sample, and it's going to cause us problems then when we're making inferences about the population. So some of these would include things like sampling bias. So despite the fact that I tell you that randomization is what we would really like to use, maybe I don't do that. I use non-probability sampling. So I use a convenience sample or purposive sampling. Then I'm going to be more likely to have error or bias. Also, maybe my randomization depends a lot on who volunteers to fill out my questionnaire. So that would also be a sampling bias, because even though I'm using random sampling, I have to still ask people to have a choice, and some people might not want to do it, right? There's also this issue called response bias. Response bias is another source of error or bias in our sampling error. This might be from poorly worded questions, or maybe the order of the questions in my survey is having an effect. Or maybe if it's an interviewer, the interviewer gives cues to the participant about how they're supposed to respond, or maybe the respondents are worried about social desirability and not looking prejudiced or whatever it is. Any of these things would be called response bias. And so again, it's going to contribute to my sampling error. When I'm trying to make some sort of estimate about the characteristics of the population, response bias gets in the way and inflates my sampling error. And then also I could just have non-response bias. And this would be where I have any kind of missing data, or perhaps there was a question that people skipped, or I couldn't reach them. So there's lots of other reasons why people aren't responding, and so that could be also contributing to my sampling error. So again, I'm trying to do randomization maybe as much as I can, but it just doesn't happen because people have a choice and they might not answer a question, okay? So in all of this, one of the things that you start to see then is that question wording is extremely important. And it's really something that we spend a lot of time on when we're doing surveys, is to think a lot about our questions. We write up our questions, we try to pre-test them as much as possible. For instance, in my research group, we try to write up our questions and then run it by other people in the lab group to see if they can understand our questions before we give it out to the sample that we're interested in. But anyway, what I want to make sure you understand is that the question wording is extremely important. It can have a lot of effects on what we can draw in terms of our conclusions about the population. There are kind of two general survey question formats that people use. One is that you could use open-ended questions. So these are questions for which the respondents provide their own answers. These tend to be things that qualitative interviewers use a lot. So when you're doing an in-depth qualitative interview, really want to have a big understanding of what this participant, this respondent, thinks about some issue, for example. That's when you tend to use open-ended questions. The disadvantage is that as rich as that kind of format is, it has the disadvantage that it's more complex, than it's harder to actually analyze the data. And so some researchers don't want to do this kind of research, use open-ended questions, because it just makes it too difficult for them to analyze their data. So what they do is they end up using what are called closed-ended questions. So these are questions in which the respondents select an answer from among a list of alternatives. Okay, so there's questions in which the respondents select an answer from among a list of alternatives. The advantage here would be then you get greater uniformity of responses that are easier to analyze. This makes it much easier than when you do your analyses to analyze your data. The disadvantage, though, is that it may miss important information because you're only letting them choose among some alternatives, and maybe you just didn't include an important alternative that would have given you some more information that's necessary when you're trying to make an inference about the population. So that would be the disadvantage of closed-ended questionnaires. So some examples of open-ended questions. This begin like something you could do in an interview. You could do this in a face-to-face or telephone interview, but you can also just put this in a questionnaire. And the question could be something like, have you ever made an error in judgment that you had to address with a supervisor, and how did you handle it? So I leave them a big text box, or if I'm doing an interview, I would maybe as the interviewer write in the answers that my respondent gave. And so, for example, they might say, yes, a few times. I was very anxious about letting her know how I messed up each time, so I waited until a quiet time of the day. So you can see it's a rich sort of answer. It's addressing the question, and perhaps it comes up, gives you information that you wouldn't have expected. And then another example could be, what do you think the problems of using solar energy are? And the person writes, like, not sure, it seems expensive. Also, are the batteries really reliable? So again, I get a flavor of what this person thinks, things that are running through their head. You'll notice that it does depend a lot on having people have good verbal ability, that they need to be able to speak well enough that you could understand them, or be able to write full sentences or whatever. There's some sort of dependence here on this person being able to fill in the box with enough information that you could then analyze. Now, what about closed-ended questions? Well, for closed-ended questions, you've run into these before, I'm sure. It could be something like, please indicate which range applies to your current age in years, like 16 to 20, 21 to 25, 26. And you would just tick a box for whatever your age is. Or it could be, are you currently in a relationship? Yes, no, not specified. Or it could be something like this, like a personality type questionnaire, where you indicate how much you agree or disagree with the item. So you can see here, I always feel fit. And you would tick a box like from strongly disagree, disagree, somewhat disagree, neither agree nor disagree, and so on, all the way up to strongly agree. This kind of closed-ended question, where you indicate how much you agree or disagree, is known as a Likert scale. So Likert, some pronounce it as Likert, but it's actually pronounced Likert after a person who invented it named Likert. And so Likert, you would indicate always how much you agree or disagree when you're looking at a Likert scale. But these are all examples of closed-ended questions, okay? And these tend to be easier to analyze than that more open-ended question. So I want to go ahead and talk just a little bit more about how you should write your questions. And these are some general tips about writing good questions for a survey. So you want to really work hard on making your questions clear, okay? Try to reduce as much ambiguity as possible in your question. So for example, I'm going to go ahead and show you a couple questions here where, they're all kind of okay, but you go back and work on them and edit them, and you can make them better. So for instance, the statement could be, or the question could be, what was your income last week? Now, that question might seem quite, clear to you, but what if the part about this is that that could be confusing is what you mean by last week. So let's say this is somebody who thinks that when you ask about their income last week, you only mean Monday through Friday, and they don't count Saturday and Sunday when they had this other job. So what would be better is if you went ahead and said, what was your income for the entire period of April 1st to April 7th? That way it's clear what days you're actually asking them about their income. You see, so you're being more precise and less ambiguous, because the first question could be answered in different ways depending on how the person interprets the question. Or the question could just simply be, are you employed full-time? And again, you might say, well, isn't that a pretty straightforward question? But some people might say, what does it mean to be full-time? Like maybe while I'm a student, full-time just means I'm working 20 hours a week or something. So what you should do instead is say something like, are you employed at least 35 hours per week? That way, your definition, the researcher's definition of full-time is clear, because you're saying, I want to know about 35 hours per week or more, okay? So that's a better way of asking the question. So this could take some work, and this is why you might do some development, running it by people, going through drafts, and so on, just to make your questions clearer and clearer. Another thing you want to do is try to avoid double-barreled questions, okay? Double-barreled questions basically ask about more than one thing. So when the person gives you an answer, you're not really clear about what they're answering, because you've asked them multiple things in one question. So here's what I mean by this. Here's not an example of a not good sort of question. Australia should withdraw from Afghanistan and spend the money on the environment. Now, Why am I saying that's a double-barreled question? Well, you'll notice that it's actually got two things it's asking about. It's asking people what their opinions are about withdrawing from Afghanistan, and it's also asking them what they should do with the money that comes from withdrawing from Afghanistan. What should they do with it? Should they spend it on the environment? Now, it could be that somebody thinks that we should withdraw from Afghanistan, but they think that the money should be used on education. Okay, so how are they supposed to answer that question? If you disagree with it, it could be that you disagree with this question because you think we shouldn't withdraw from Afghanistan, but it also could just be because you disagree with how the money should be spent. So a better way of asking a question like this is to really break it down into two questions, because you had two questions to begin with. So in your opinion, should Australia withdraw from Afghanistan? So that's just one question you're asking them. And then a separate question would be, would you like Australia to spend more money on the environment? So that this way, this thing that you asked about in a double-barreled way is now being asked about in two separate questions. You should also try to avoid negative and double negative questions. This kind of goes back to this idea that we just want to make sure our questions are as clear as possible. So here's a real question that was asked a few years ago. Would you favor or oppose a law that would prevent any foreign-owned company owning cargo operations at seaports in the US? Now, I notice that this question says, would prevent any foreign-owned company at seaports in the US. When that question was asked that way, with a negative in it, it was 58% opposed. So 58% of the respondents on that questionnaire disagreed with this or opposed that law. A better way, though, would be to get rid of the negative and turn it into a positively worded item. Would you favor or oppose a law that would allow only US companies to own cargo operations at seaports in the US? Now, this has the same meaning as the question before, but you'll notice that when they asked this question, only 25% of the people opposed the law. So it's the same issue, whether you're talking about the one on the left or the one on the right, but because of getting rid of the negative, we found that the opposition wasn't as great as it was in the previous wording. So wording really matters, and focusing on things like negatives and double negatives just to increase the clarity of your questions is really going to help. You also want to try to do what's called reverse scoring or wording across the items. And this helps you get rid of a particular bias that some people have. It's a response bias in which some people, when they see questionnaires where they could agree or disagree with it, they tend to just want to agree with everything or they want to disagree with everything. And how would you know then that they have this bias that they just want to agree with everything or disagree with everything? Unless you use reverse scoring or reverse wording across these items. There's a very famous psychology scale out there called the Rosenberg Self-Esteem Scale that was developed back in 1965. It's a 10-item scale, and you're supposed to indicate how much you agree or disagree with each statement on a 1 to 5 scale. And so you can see here are the items, like on the whole, I am satisfied with myself. At times, I think I'm no good at all. I feel that I have a number of good qualities. I'm able to do things as well as most other people. I feel I do not have much to be proud of. I certainly feel useless at times, and so on. So these 10 items are supposed to be a way to measure a person's self-esteem, how they feel about themselves. And what you would do is have a respondent go ahead and to indicate how much they agree or disagree with each of those statements. But if you go back and look at it more carefully, you realize that some of these items are actually reverse scored or reverse worded. And so the ones that are in red that I have indicated here are reverse scored or reverse keyed from the way the questions in black are. So what I mean by this is, imagine that you are somebody who feels really good about yourself. You have high self-esteem. So on question number 1, it says, on the whole, I am satisfied with myself, and I'm supposed to agree or disagree with it. Well, I would be, if I have high self-esteem, agree with that. But now if I go to number 2, it says, at times I think I am no good at all. Well, if I'm somebody with high self-esteem, then I should disagree with that item. 3, I should agree with it. 4, I should agree with it if I have high self-esteem. But number 5, I should disagree with it if I have high self-esteem. I feel I do not have much to be proud of. You see, that's what we mean by reverse scoring or reverse wording. As I go from the black to the red items, I'm switching which side a person should agree or disagree with, if they are all measuring the same thing or measuring the same propensity or whatever it is. This helps us get around response bias. So if I have somebody who just goes through and says, I agree, I agree, I agree on all 10 of those items, that would tell me then that perhaps I've got somebody who's just got a response bias, and perhaps I should go ahead and eliminate that person's data from my study because maybe they're not really reading the questions, or they just have this propensity to always want to agree with everything. So that is why I want to reverse score or reverse word these items. So I can mix it up a bit and see if I can really get at a response bias. All right. Some other final tips about how to write good questions for your questionnaire in your survey. For studies that that are being conducted in a specific organization, like let's say you're measuring farmers' attitudes, or you're working in a government agency, or you're working in the schools, try to use the jargon that's used in that organization. So it really helps if you know your sample well enough, for the population from which you're trying to make an inference about, that you use their jargon and use the kind of terms that they would use for whatever it is that they do. But be careful not to use language that may be unfamiliar to the respondents. So try not to use, if you are trying to use a really broad survey, be careful about the kinds of terms that you do use, because there could be some respondents who are not familiar with that word or what that term is. Therefore, you should try to avoid unnecessary abbreviations when you can, because again, abbreviations are one of those things that sometimes people have a very clear idea what the abbreviation is, and other people don't know what the abbreviation is. And so that would create some bias and some sample error. And then try to use simple words. So the simpler you can write your sentences, your questions, the better. And try to avoid biased items in terms. So things that might tip off the way that you want your respondents to answer. So any of these things, all of these things, by the way, are going to help reduce your sample error and make you feel more confident that you actually could make an inference about the population. So that's how we write the questions, and we, like I said, spend a lot of time thinking about them, pre-testing them, and working them out before we give them out to our sample that we've collected. At UQ, I can tell you that most psychology researchers use a platform called Qualtrics to administer their questionnaires. So Qualtrics is a company that makes tools available on the web for us to write up our questions. There's another company like this called SurveyMonkey that also has ways or tools for us to administer questionnaires. But this is a very common way for us to create questions that we can administer online to participants. I could even, for instance, have my questions in a lab, have my participants in a lab format answering questionnaires, but just have them fill it out on the computer using Qualtrics. So this becomes a very commonly used tool for us to administer our questionnaire. So I thought I'd give you a quick tour of what that's like. Okay, so now where I am at is in psychology. We have a website for researchers to click on, and on this particular website, I'm going to click on Launch Qualtrics, and you'll be able to see what I can see when I want to construct a study. So these are all the different studies that I'm working on. I have my students who are actually the co-owners of these surveys masked here for your viewing pleasure, but I want to just go ahead and show you exactly what it looks like here. So I'm going to click on this thing called Example Anonymity Questionnaire. And if I go ahead and click on that, it opens up, and you can now see my study in terms of what I might do in running this particular experiment. So this is my behind the scenes look at my questionnaire, and then you can see that I have different questions here asking things like what's your primary language, what's your highest level of education, what's your current relationship status, and so on. And if I want to go ahead and create a new question, I just thought you might be interested in how I do that. I go here and click on this button here. It says add new question. And so now it gives me all these different choices. I can do text entry, which lets me do open-ended questions. I can do multiple choice, which lets me do closed-ended questions. I can also do things that are called matrices, where I can just tick buttons. I can use sliders. I can have a form field. I can even do rank ordering of different things like which soda, which soft drink do I like the best, and so on. Let's just say, for instance, I pick multiple choice, and you can see what I can do here is then I can just say things like the best, what is better, cats or dogs. And then I could just write down here, my choices are cats, Dogs. Neither. Okay, and so then that question, when I administer it in my survey, would just pop up as an individual question that people could answer. And then the data gets saved as they click their buttons here. This is what gets saved to my data file, and I have a response from my participants. They also have questions on here that you can grab from a library of questions. So if I pick this here, if I click on import from library, this allows us then to look at questions that are kind of routinely used by researchers. So for instance, here's a whole set of questions here, like I can pick on demographics, and I could pick this particular one. And you can see now that it asks a bunch of questions here that have already been written before that I might want to use in my study. So for instance, I might pick, let's see, use this 7-point scale. I'm going to click that one, say import it. And then you can say here, it says, here's a 7-point scale in which the political views that people might hold are ranged from extremely liberal left to extremely conservative right. Where would you place yourself on the scale? And the idea would be that the person could then pick where they want to go on this particular scale. Okay, so there's many, many different choices here when you use Qualtrics for us to be able to come up with different kinds of questions. And then the other thing that I want to do is I want to maybe have some order in the way the questions are asked. I can put different random orders in here. You can see here I have if-then branches. That means like if I have a particular answer to a question, maybe there's other questions that people who say yes to that question would only see, but if people say no to the question, then they get different sets of questions. All of this is called survey flow, and allows me then to tailor my questions in a particular order in a way that I want to have done. For example, we do know that the order of questions matters a lot, so I might want to go ahead and randomly order some of these questions so that every time a different participant fills out my questionnaire, they're going to get it in a different order from somebody else. There's all these kinds of options here that are done using this survey flow option. And then you can also do things like the look and feel of your questionnaire. You can change the kind of overall banner, that kind of thing. It's got different languages that you could pick. You could try to translate it. It has all sorts of actions here in terms of how I want to distribute my questionnaire, what options I want to have for it. So that's what this is. The actions are but just different things I might want to do to automate the tasks in terms of how I want to distribute my questionnaire. So another options here I click on. You can see whether I want to do it by email, web, social, mobile, online panel. And when I actually have data, I can analyze my data using tools that are here in Qualtrics as well. And what we typically do is collect our data and then export it into an Excel file that we could use to analyze our data with SPSS or R or Jamovi. And so that's how I would take my data and export it so I could then analyze it later on once I have responses. Because this is actually just a fake questionnaire that I'm showing you, you can notice that my responses in progress are 0. I don't have anybody who's actually filling this out. So if I had this being administered, I could actually see the responses coming in live right here. So that's Qualtrics, a powerful tool that we can use in psychology to design questionnaires. All right, so that completes the first part of this lecture on survey design, where I've talked about some key definitions, the types of surveys that we can do, some of our sampling methods, this issue about error and bias, and how to write good questions for your survey. So let's turn to the second part of this lecture, which is on ethics. And ethics is something that really transcends all of the issues that we've been talking about, whether we're doing an experiment, a quasi-experiment, survey, case studies. Ethics here has to do with our research ethics, and I'm going to be talking about how our ethics guidelines for research were developed, a little bit about the history of that. I'm going to talk about 4 main categories of risk that we have to human participants in particular, and then we'll also talk more about some of the key principles guiding ethical research with human participants. I mentioned it at this point of the course because we're really still back here about designing a study. So as we design our studies and figure out what our independent and dependent variables are, another important aspect of designing a study is our consideration of our ethics. So what the ethical guidelines are. So I think of this to design and understand a research, you need to know a lot, of course, about these principles such as randomization, causal inference, and so on. But I also believe that ethical principles are every bit as important to the real business of doing psychological research as any of these other ideas. So that's why I'm inserting it here. Okay, so consider the ethics of your research when you're first designing your study. Some things are really, not anything that's controversial, and you might find that there's not a whole lot to consider, but always stop and consider what the ethical ramifications are of your research and what the ethical principles are for researchers as you design your study. We have some examples in history of some infamous research where the researchers didn't really think about any of these issues. So, for example, one of the more notorious examples of poor ethics in research was the Tuskegee syphilis study that was conducted in the United States back in 1932. And so what happened was, in the state of Alabama in the United States, the Tuskegee Institute was really interested in how syphilis, this venereal disease, gets tracked and what will happen if you don't actually treat it. So what they did was they found 600 poor, illiterate male sharecroppers who were mostly African American, who lived in Macon County, Alabama. And of these 600 men, only 399 had previously contracted syphilis, and none of them were told that they had a life-threatening disease. So instead, they were told they would be receiving free health care, meals, and burial insurance in exchange for participating. But really what was going on is that the researchers were not treating their syphilis. So even after penicillin was proven an effective cure for syphilis in 1947, the study just continued to go on until 1972. For 40 years then, these 600 men were studied, not properly being treated for their syphilis, so that the researchers could find out what would happen if you don't treat the syphilis. So in addition to the original subjects, of course, the victims of the study also included the wives of these men who contracted the disease, and also the children who were born with congenital syphilis. So it's a horrible study and has terrible ethical ramifications because the participants were not told fully what was going on in this particular study. All right, another example of a study that's like this is has poor ethics is this study called the Monster Study from back in 1939. And what this study was done, I think, at the University of Iowa in the United States, was that young children were having problems with speech, and half the children were given a speech therapy in which they were being praised all the time, every time they made progress in their treatment for their speech problems. But on the other half, the participants who were in the speech therapy, they were belittled and put down for having speech imperfections. So the researcher or the therapist that was working with them would go ahead and berate them and make them cry and be really mean about the fact that they had these speech problems. And so the researchers wanted to know which of those two methods was more effective in helping them. But they really were really terrible to these kids who were in the negative speech therapy condition, as you can imagine, and caused them a lot of stress and crying. And a lot of those kids had a hard time as a result of being in the study. And then also here in Australia, we have some notorious examples. So for example, the University of Adelaide in the 1920s and 1930s set out to go out into the Australian outback to do really crude research on Aboriginal people, including studying how they dealt with pain. They would hold them down and take blood samples from them and take body measurements. And basically, these Aboriginal people were treated as if they were just sort of like natural wildlife out in the outback, and just were captured and measured for the purposes of this research. And it took many decades before this all came out, and eventually the University of Adelaide let out a formal apology about how these researchers had done this work back in the 20s and 30s. Also, the University of Melbourne was found back in the 1950s to be doing research on children who were in state care. And so these were children who had been, for some reason, taken from their homes, maybe for abuse or because of neglect. And while they were in state care, the University of Melbourne would go ahead and do research on them with no permission from any parents or anything. So these kids were basically subjected to different kinds of psychology studies and other kinds of studies without any parent or adult giving consent. It was like the kids were just now they're free guinea pigs to use in their research. And so again, many decades passed, and eventually the University of Melbourne had to apologize for the work that they had done back in the 1950s. So plenty of notorious examples, even here in Australia. But perhaps the most famous or infamous example of research was the Nazi experimentation that occurred in the concentration camps in World War II. And I don't think I really have to go into some of the horrible things that these doctors did in these concentration camps, but suffice it to say, they were really obviously terrible and against a lot of these people's wishes. They weren't, really giving their consent to be experimented on. The doctors just felt like, hey, they're in my camp, I can do what I want with them. And so after the war, a bunch of these doctors from these different concentration camps were rounded up and put on trial in the city of Nuremberg in Germany. And this is actually a photograph of several of these doctors who were on trial from 1946 to 1947. And as a result of that trial, the world learned more about some of the horrible experiments that these doctors had performed on the prisoners in their camps. The world was so horrified by the things that they heard about in this Nuremberg trial between 46 and 47 that eventually what happened was researchers around the world started to come up with ideas about things to prevent this from ever happening again. So after World War II was over and we have the Nuremberg trial, there was something called the Nuremberg Code, which was inspired by the events of that trial and what doctors have been doing. So these are 10 guidelines that researchers started to pass amongst each other, particularly in medical research, about what they should or shouldn't be doing when they conduct research. And number one was that research participants must voluntarily consent to research participation. That clearly didn't happen in these concentration camps. The participants were not given the choice of whether or not they wanted to participate in the research. They just were subjected to the torture, the horrible things that these doctors wanted to do. So from this point on, the idea was that all research participants, no matter who they are, should voluntarily consent to research participation. Now, secondly, according to the Nuremberg Code, research aims should contribute to the good of society. So there shouldn't be frivolous research being done or research that's going to hurt people. It should be that you're trying to contribute to the good of society when you conduct your research. The research must be based on sound theory and prior animal testing. Now, this is an interesting one. Again, this is coming out of medical research. And so the idea here is that there should be some really good reasons why this research is being done based on what we know about viruses or whatever it happens to be, and maybe even like from prior animal testing before it's conducted on humans. So I know that some people might have an issue of even doing animal testing, but back then the idea was that you shouldn't be doing any human experimentation unless you can show safely that it can be done from doing prior animal testing. That the research must avoid unnecessary physical and mental suffering. So there shouldn't be people crying out in pain, and there shouldn't be a lot of anguish and people crying and that kind of thing as a result of your research. This research must try to avoid this. That no research project can go forward where serious injury and or death are potential outcomes. So if there's some assessment that participating in this research could cause your death or that you're going to be seriously injured, no way should that research be conducted. The degree of risk taken with research participants cannot exceed the anticipated benefits of results. So the point here is that for every research study we do, we should always be doing a risk-benefit analysis. We think about whatever benefits there might be that come out of the research should be weighed against whatever risks that we're putting the participants in. 7, that there should be proper environment and protection for the participants. This is necessary to make sure that they're safe. The experiments can be conducted only by scientifically qualified persons, so it should matter a lot who the people are that are actually conducting the research. Number 9, that human subjects must be allowed to discontinue their participation at any time. So they should be able to be told at any time that they're in the study that if they don't want to continue, they can just stop and there won't be any ramifications, any harm to them if they decide to discontinue their participation. And 10, scientists must be prepared to terminate the experiment if there is cause to believe that continuation will be harmful or result in injury or death. So if something comes up in this research project where the scientists can figure out, hey, if we keep doing this, some people are really going to be hurt, they should ethically be bound then to stop the experiment, stop it. So those are the guidelines that came up after World War II through the 1950s and were guidelines that were passed around among medical researchers in different countries. And the idea was that your country, the researchers there, would adopt these 10 guidelines. And therefore, if everybody did this universally, we wouldn't have a repeat any of those bad experiments that had happened in the past. In 1964, there was something called the Helsinki Declaration. This is when the World Medical Association codified those guidelines into a code. That is, until 1964, it was just more like a loose list of 10 guidelines that you could or could not, follow. But now the World Medical Association said, hey, we're going to make this, very strict rules that if you want to be part of the World Medical Association, you have to follow the Nuremberg Code. And since 1964, it's been revised and updated periodically because, of course, there are other things to be considered besides those 10 original guidelines. So additional principles that have happened since then is that, for instance, the necessity of using an independent investigator to review potential research projects. So it shouldn't really just be up to an individual researcher to decide whether or not their research is ethical. This means that in order to conduct a research, somebody else who's not connected to the research should review it to see if it actually follows the ethical guideline. That you should employ a medically qualified person to supervise the research and assume responsibility for the health and welfare of the human subjects. So again, remember that this originally came out of medical research. And so the idea here is that you should make sure that in your research staff, you have a medically qualified person to supervise the research. That there's this importance of preserving the accuracy of the research results. So if you're going to collect these data, make sure that the data are collected accurately, that there's not error in the way that the data are collected and so on, because this will have ramifications for whether or not we can really learn from the research project. And there were also suggestions on how to obtain informed consent from research participants, because it became clear that, sure, we want everybody to give us their consent, but exactly how do we know that they understood everything, and how do we document their consent? And there should also be rules concerning research with children who might not be fully mentally competent yet to make informed consent decisions, and also mentally incompetent people who might for some reason not really understand questions or not have the capacity to know whether or not they should be in the research. So these are additional principles that ended up being part of that Helsinki Declaration based on the Nuremberg Code. Then you see that different medical bodies around the world started to adopt those guidelines and codify them for their own government. And here in Australia, the National Health and Medical Research Council, which is our main agency in the government that oversees our research for health and medical research, the NHMRC issued a 1966 statement on human experimentation that was based on the Helsinki Declaration. So that's when we first get codification here of a set of rules that are now have to be adopted by researchers who are doing medical and health research in Australia. In 1985, it became a requirement that any institution that receives NHMRC funds must follow this statement. So this means that any hospital, any university that conducts research and then gets money from the Australian government, from the NHMRC to conduct that research, has to show that they're following the statement. So this is sort of like the enforcement aspect of it. Up until 1985, there wasn't really these strong requirements or strong restrictions on your funding if you weren't following it. But since 1985, it now is connected so that, for instance, the University of Queensland, because it receives money from the NHMRC, has to show that all of their researchers follow the national statement. So this national statement has been updated a few times over its history. This is this National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research, published by the NHMRC. It was updated in 1999, 2005, 2015, and even again just recently in the last couple of years. And I understand that there's going to be another updated version of the national statement. So you can find the national statement up on our the NHMRC website. They always keep the latest version of it up there. It's a free PDF. And they would really like to have anybody who's doing human research at any university or hospital or any other institution know what the guidelines are in the national statement. I should just point out, by the way, that this is just for human research, but you could also have ethical guidelines for animal research. And so the Australian government, the NHMRC, also has a code of practice for the care or use of animals for scientific purposes. This course is really focused on human research, so I'm not really going to get into that. But animal ethics does require many legal regulations about what can be done with different kinds of animals in research, including even things like the ventilation of the lab, what kind of food they get, how, if you're going to cause pain to an animal, what's the capacity for that. All of that has to go through a committee. So if you want to do research on rats, for example, you would have to put up a proposal about how you want to do this research on rats, and would go through a committee that then checks against these guidelines to see if you're actually doing, if you're following ethical guidelines for the treatment of animals for scientific purposes. I'll mention there's one other kind of ethics that you'll hear more about later on if you decide to go and become a professional psychologist, and that would be clinical ethics, or a code of ethics about how you should practice as a professional. So this isn't really about research. This is more about how, as a registered clinical psychologist, for example, you should follow a particular set of ethical guidelines. And so this has things like this, like the general principle integrity reflects the need for psychologists to have good character and acknowledges the high level of trust intrinsic to their professional relationships and impact of their conduct on the reputation of the profession. So you can see this is more about how, like, psychologists might respond to their clients and what the relationships could be with clients and so on. So there are these other ethical guidelines, but we're not covering them in this course because this isn't really about research, these particular ethical guidelines. Okay. So how then do we review the ethics of a planned study? Because you remember back there in the Helsinki Declaration, it said that an independent researcher should look at your plan. And so we have that in our national statement in NHMRC, and it's also done in other countries as well, where we do require that when you have a study that you want to do, that you need to have an independent investigator review this and look at it to see if it's ethical. We have different kinds of ethics, levels of risk in our ethics. So we could have a study that's considered low risk, and this is where the only foreseeable risk to our participants is one of discomfort. And this would include many of our student research projects. So by discomfort, I mean like just to, maybe it's asking a couple questions that are slightly embarrassing, or they have to take some time out of their day to answer these questions. That's what we mean by low risk and having only just discomfort. Negligible risk is even less than that. This is where the only thing is inconvenience. And so the participation in the study means that maybe you're going to be a little late to your next appointment, but there's nothing else. There's nothing embarrassing. It's negligible risk. So we group these two kinds of research as low or negligible risk. And these kinds of studies get treated differently for review than other kinds of research. Any other research that's above low risk or negligible requires review by a Human Research Ethics Committee in Australia. The Human Research Ethics Committee is also known as an HREC, H-R-E-C. And the Human Research Ethics Committee then, on a regular basis, will review all of the ethics at their institution that are above low risk and negligible risk. The low and negligible risk can be handled separately by the institution in a way that it sees fit. So we have different ways of handling that. At UQ, for example, it still goes through a little committee of low and negligible risk that can be handled just via email, so nobody actually has to meet in person. You would fill out a form, tick a box that says that your research is low risk or negligible risk, pass off your form about what you want to do, email it to a office on campus, and then somebody by email is going to go ahead and review whether or not your study is actually low risk or negligible risk, and then approve it. If it's something, though, that's going to have to go to an HREC, it's a much longer application, and it requires a lot of materials that have to be sent off to that. Okay, so again, research that needs to be approved by a relevant ethics committee in psychology at UQ, our L&R research is reviewed by members of the HABS faculty, our Faculty of Health and Behavioral Sciences, and there's a low and negligible risk committee. And maybe just one or two members of that committee will actually review your research to decide whether or not it's ethical. But the other research is then reviewed by a university-wide ethics committee, the HREC, at a monthly meeting. And so at that big HREC meeting, there might be 10 or 15 university-wide projects that were proposed in the past month, and that committee has to go back through and evaluate whether or not this research is ethical. Now, how do they know stuff is ethical? Well, the guidelines that are in the national statement specify all of the things that you need to consider. But I'll go ahead and boil down a lot of those considerations to 4 main categories of risk to human participants. Okay? So I'm going to talk about 4 main categories of risk to people in research that could be done today. One category of risk is what's called stress. Then we have breaches of confidentiality, deception, and invasive procedures. So those are our 4 main categories of risk that we evaluate new research studies on. Let's take stress. Now, stress sometimes can't be avoided, especially if in psychology research, stress is what the researchers are actually investigating. This is quite a plausible scenario because, like I said, a lot of psychologists are interested in this, from clinical, organizational, cognitive, and in fact, they might try to stress out their participants a little bit. My research group, for instance, has tried to increase stress in our participants by asking them to take their hand and put it into a bucket of cold ice water and hold it there for as long as they can, and it actually stresses them out. Or another kind of stressful task would be that we ask them to prepare a speech that they're going to have to give on camera to some other people. But the point is that, yes, I'm stressing out the participant, but we don't want it to become too severe. The stress shouldn't be too great, especially that the stress shouldn't persist outside the experimental session. So when they go home, they shouldn't still be stressed out. So researchers who are interested in stress couldn't actually do the stress research. They could try to stress their participant during the experiment, but it can't be too great. It can't be lasting. And in fact, most of the time, what researchers should do is try to minimize this so there isn't any stress during the experiment, unless it is actually the point of the research. Confidentiality is another risk, and this is important because oftentimes participants are giving really sensitive information to the researchers about their self-esteem, about their family history, their attitudes about controversial topics. And so that because all these different kinds of sensitive information could be gathered in a study, it really is important then that researchers don't abuse the trust that's being placed in them, and they maintain the confidentiality of their participants. So what they could do is use like pseudonyms when they talk about the research, or initials, or where they might go ahead and make all of their data anonymous and strip out any identifying information so that nobody ever could find out who said what in their study. So confidentiality becomes a really big, important concern in research, and something that I often have to look at research proposals and decide whether or not they've really dealt adequately with confidentiality. Another potential risk is deception. This involves not giving the participants the entire truth. In fact, you might even give them false information, maybe not tell them exactly what the study is about. You give them a cover story. You say, maybe I'm really interested in stress, but I don't want them to know that I'm interested in stress. So I go ahead and tell them I'm interested in performance or something else, and it's not about stress. Now, why would that be necessary? And the reason is that in many experiments, there are sort of like elaborate setups in which we want the participant to act the way that they normally would act in the everyday world. And so we have to kind of create these sort of elaborate stories about what's going on so we can get them to act as naturally as possible. If they knew everything that was going on in the experiment, perhaps they would be so self-conscious of themselves that they wouldn't act normal. And so that's why you sometimes have deception about things like a cover story, not telling them everything that you're going to be doing in the study. It could even be that you're using fake feedback. You could be telling them that they did poorly on a questionnaire, on a test that you just gave them, but they actually did quite well. It could even be that you have an actor working with you in the study who's acting like they're a participant, but they're not really. Traditionally, that person's been called a confederate. So a confederate is somebody who acts like another participant, or you could call them a stooge. Somebody who's they're acting like they're another participant, but they're not really. All of that is deception, and that would mean then that we've now not told our participants everything they needed to know, and we've misled them. So, like I said, this is sometimes used, and therefore we need to think about this. So obviously there are arguments against this. Some disciplines, for instance in economics, have banned deception altogether. They say they shouldn't have any deception in research. And the reason is because it's just, first of all, simply wrong to lie. Secondly, it undermines a position of trust that our participants might have about research and about experimenters. And it also could just make people feel bad when they find out at the end of the study that they've been tricked or been lied to, and they might feel embarrassed and feel really bad for the rest of the day because they feel like they were duped during the study. So that is one of the things we need to consider in terms of like arguments against deception. So a potential alternative to this is to do things like not use deception as much as possible. You could use what's called simulation, in which you ask the participants to imagine that they're in a particular situation or to role play a particular part. This would be all stuff that you could do to try to not lie to them, not give them misinformation, to try to get them to participate in a way that's realistic, but you're doing it through simulation or through role playing. The problem with that, of course, is that they still are just then role playing. We don't really know if that's the way they would really act. So if you have really a very strong need to have deception in your study, you could go ahead and propose it, have it read by the ethics committee to see whether or not they think it's not too bad. But one of the things you're definitely going to have to do then is have what's called a debriefing at the end. And this is essential when deception is used. If you do it well, this can also contribute to the participant's educational experience. So at the end of the study, you sit down with the participant and you tell them, I'm sorry, I didn't tell you everything we're going to be doing in this study. That feedback that I gave you on that particular test wasn't actually your feedback. You go ahead and let them know everything you possibly did that was deceptive, all right? And maybe even had a fake person there who was acting like they were another participant. But then you would have to explain to the participant why you used deception. You want to have them understand why it was so essential to this experiment to do that. And further, now that you've gone ahead and debriefed them, you now give them the chance to withdraw their data. So after you've gone through and fully debriefed them, you could say to them, okay, now that I've told you everything that happened in this study at the end of the study, I'm going to give you another chance here if you'd like. You don't have to have your data included because I wasn't able to tell you all this stuff in the first place. So if you'd like, I will delete your data. It's up to you. And so you give them a chance to withdraw their data or not. And the idea here is that you're giving them now another chance to consent, fully knowing everything after the fact. And so they might want to have that video that you recorded because you didn't tell them about it deleted. Or they don't want to have their answers to a particular set of questions included in the data set because they feel like they were cheated or lied to. It's up to the individual participant to let them have that agency, let them decide whether or not they still want to have their data included. All right, and then we have invasive procedures. This is our last category of risk. And this would be where there's a research practice that's given that's actually going to change the participant. So it could be that you're giving them some sort of drug. Maybe there's something that has to be inserted or connected to their body that could possibly cause them to bleed or get harmed. That's what we mean by invasive procedures. We don't want to do this very much, but sometimes it's necessary depending on the kind of research that's being done. It could also be that perhaps you're going to give them feedback or tell them something really important that could really change them emotionally, and that would be another important kind of invasive procedure. So again, you want to, as a researcher, try to minimize any long-term effects of these invasive procedures as much as possible, and you would have to run these again by your ethics committee that's reviewing your research. So here finally are some key principles in guiding ethical research with human participants. So as you design your own research study, try to go through these 4 key principles. Number 1, the research should minimize the risk to participants. And if there are any negative effects upon the participants, the researcher has the responsibility to correct those negative effects. All right? So you're trying to minimize the stress, you're trying to minimize the deception, but if you have to use deception, you have to stress them out. You need to make sure they're feeling good when they leave at the end of the study, that you've now fully debriefed them, you've reduced their stress, there isn't any long-term harm. Number 2, if at all possible or practical, participation should be based on informed consent. or from guardians in the case of the children, from children or people who don't have the capacity. So you really would like as much as possible to have informed consent. Informed means that you've told them pretty much everything that's important to know about the study so they can make a decision about whether or not they want to participate. Number 3, participants should be free to discontinue participation at any time. They do not have to give any reason to the researcher for why they want to discontinue. So if they want to just get up and walk away, they should feel free to do that. That should be clear to them at the beginning of the study. And number 4, participants should be properly debriefed. Partly, this is to minimize harm, but if the research process is to be of educational benefit, participants need to be told what the research was about and what it was trying to achieve. Okay, so this is like debriefing them about anything that you didn't fully tell them about before, but also just letting them know why did we do this research so that they can feel like they participated in a worthy enterprise that's actually going to help us with our knowledge about human behavior or cognition or whatever it happens. Keep in mind that participants should also be encouraged to ask questions and are entitled to have those answered to their satisfaction. So it should really be a dialogue throughout the entire experiment or the entire study that the participants should be able to really ask questions like, why is that over there? Why are you doing that now? What if I want to leave right now? They have that freedom to do that. It's not like they come in, they've agreed to do the experiment, now you can do whatever you want to them for the next 45 minutes without any questions. No, it has to be an ongoing activity where the participants are free to ask questions. Okay? All right, so those are concerns having to do with ethics and guidelines for you to think about when you design your study. So again, going back to the entire lecture here, what we've covered the last couple of weeks is how we go about designing a study, whether it's an experiment or survey design, and then finally also considering about ethics, the ethical guidelines that, for instance, the Australian government puts out, or in any country, most countries around the world have ethical guidelines for human research, that you should be aware of them in that country where you are to collect data. So I talked about survey design and ethics, and that's all I have for this week.